Let's go ahead and how's it going, folks? We are live. I'm here with Brent Hamachek. Brent is the Director of Operations and the Director of Content at Human Events. I believe that is your title. And Brent, I'm happy to have Brent on because Brent's written a couple of interesting articles and kind of wanted to talk through them on this show. And obviously, I also wanted to introduce you guys to Brent, as somebody who's directly involved with Human Events and the publication, kind of introducing you all to the people who I work with and who help make Human Events, a kind of very interesting, enlightening place to be. So welcome, Brent. I don't know if you just want to take a chance to introduce yourself and what you're up to.
Well, sure. First of all, I mean, it's a pleasure to be here. It's a little intimidating. Charlie Kirk describes you as one of the most intelligent people he's ever met. So I'm appropriately sitting and trembling, a little shaking. So I'm going to ease into this little small talk to get myself calmed down. But I'm the Director of Content and Operation for the Human Events news side. And all of your viewers know that you picked this great tradition up that was Human Events last year and revived it. You sort of went all hush puppies on it and picked up a dead brand, a dormant brand, and have blown fresh life into it. And I've been working with Jeff Webb for a couple of years now, and Jeff joined you late last year as on the news side to build a news side to go with the traditional opinion side of Human Events. And so it's just, for me, it's the treat of a lifetime to be able, first of all, to work with the two of you, are two remarkably great and intelligent people. And then also to be able to step into a platform like this. I mean, I'm an old guy. It's funny. You had Alan Dershowitz on a couple of weeks ago. You've got me. I feel like you're casting for Cocoon 4 or whatever it is. But, I subscribed to Human Events when I was in college, back when you got things in what we would call the mail. And so now, years later, to be involved in creating content, working alongside somebody young and bright like yourself is a real privilege. So I'm very excited about it.
Yeah, no, I mean, I've really enjoyed it too. Jeff is just super competent. So if you guys don't know, Jeff Webb was the former CEO of Varsity Brands, which was like the cheerleading Goliath of cheerleading apparel. Not just that, but also I think, he was heavily involved in organizing cheerleading competitions and building it into a major sport, in our country. And now he's kind of shifted focus to politics and is working with us, and is co-publisher alongside me. Anyway, so that's kind of y'all know me. I'm Will. This is my Periscope. So, we and also we're on Facebook and YouTube, but I'm the, co-publisher of Human Events, and I'm also senior counsel at the Internet Accountability Project. And so Brent has written a couple interesting pieces that I kind of wanted to get into. And one, I thought, I want to start with a shorter one and we'll get into the longer one later. But Brent wrote as kind of a second piece, Brent's a Springsteen fan. And, I think wrote a piece entitled, "I'm happy to meet you in the middle, Bruce. Any idea where it is?" And I just want to give you a chance, go ahead and lay out your argument as you see it from this piece.
Right. Well, thank you. First of all, I can't ever appear on anybody's show, at least especially for the first time, and not give a lot of thanks to our mutual friend, Charlie Kirk. I mean, if it weren't for Charlie Kirk, I wouldn't be sitting here with you today. If I go back to when I was in college, which was a very long time ago, my dream was to study economics, political science, graduate, and then go out and change the world. Well, I did study those things, and then I graduated, and I really didn't do anything until, other than have a successful business career, until I met Charlie about 7 years ago, so 7 or 8 years ago, and we began working together. So he spotted something. So God love him for that. One of the theories that I had been working on prior to meeting him, that I introduced to him and he allowed me to publish through Turning Point, was this idea of what I call how America broke its wings. And we hear all the time people talk about right wing and left wing. And what I had come to understand and researched and studied over time is not just where the terms came from, but also the fact that they actually have no definitive meaning, and the fact that they really are just nothing more than pejorative terms. to pull it forward to the Springsteen thing and try to make some sense out of this, you know, he did his Super Bowl commercial where he said, you know, America, let's meet in the middle. And the headline of my article really made the argument. It said, okay, I'll meet you in the middle. Tell me where it is. And we talk about people in the middle all the time, but it's just a term we use. The truth is, if you ask 10 people to define it, you'll get 10 different definitions. And that's because there actually is no objective definition to it. And my argument is that we do not have a political continuum in this country that goes from right to left, the traditional left being communist and the traditional right being fascist. I mean, my point is, what are you if you're halfway between the middle point and the end point? Are you like half fascist and half libertarian? I don't know what you are, right? So there is no definable middle. What we do have, though, in America are two political teams. We have team left and team right. And by the way, we use that language now at Human Events News. We do not use the term left wing or right wing. We use the terms team right and team left because the structure, Will, as I've come to understand it, imagine a professional football team, for example. Mm-hmm. You have offense, defense, and special teams, right? And whenever one of those three units is on the field, the other two are sort of on the sidelines cheering for them. Well, that's the structure we have in American politics. So on, say, team left, we have pro-choice. And on team right, we have pro-life. On team left, we have gun control. And on team right, we have the pro-Second Amendment folks, and so on, right? So it's almost Hegelian. There's a thesis and antithesis. Unfortunately, there's no synthesis is the problem. What happens with people as a result of a lot of interviews I did over time, people tend to wind up on either team right or team left based on what their primary driving issue is. So, for example, long before I knew it existed, I wound up on team right because my real driving issue is that I'm a free market guy, right? I really believe in the power of individual liberty and free markets. That's on team right. And so I wound up on team right, which means you find yourself when your other platoons are on the field, you're going to find yourself cheering for them. It doesn't mean you understand anything about offense or special teams if you're a defensive player, but you're cheering for the units. So this is what causes the discordance in American politics. We have a lot of people who yell and scream loudly because that makes up for a lack of knowledge and serious thought, because all they're doing is cheering for their team. And so when Bruce Springsteen says, let's meet in the middle, and I say, where is it? It's actually a very real question. And it's actually also a question that can't be answered. But the final point is this. I believe that if we want to substitute this notion of meeting in the non-existent middle, what we should substitute is this simple question. So every time as a society we face an issue, a problem that we've got to solve, and we want to use government somehow to address it, here's the question we should ask. How much of my individual liberty am I willing to sacrifice in order to address this problem? Because government can't act unless it's undoing something. It can't act without restricting liberty in some form. That's definitional. So if all of us could get together and we could ask that question, and we debate it, right? Different people would be willing to sacrifice different amounts of liberty to solve a problem. But at least then we might be able to have a context in which we could, I don't know, meet in something that looks like the middle, which in the world of business, which is where I come from, we simply call a compromise and making a decision, right? So there's a broad overview, and I encourage people to read the piece and also take a look at the longer publication, How America Broke Its Wings, which is a Turning Point publication.
Cool. All right. So yeah, I mean, that's a pretty good distillation of the argument as I read it. I thought, so to start, I thought, you're right on the point of like, there isn't an obvious middle. I think I'd go back to just not even thinking about that from the perspective of, our political continuum, but also think about what it meant to be a moderate 100 years ago or what it meant to be a moderate 200 years ago, right? If you're a moderate 150 years ago, you're thinking about, well, monarchy is actually pretty good, and this democratic stuff, I'm not so sure about. That seems pretty radical and left wing. You can easily take yourself to a position where you're, historically in a place and time where the center of politics is something that we wouldn't even recognize, and which would be far left or far right. And indeed, the modern right 50 years ago probably would have been seen as a left wing position in terms of the things we embrace now. So generally, I think, it's when people say, let's meet in the middle, there's always this assumption that just being a moderate has some inherent good to it, right? Like the idea of moderation in all things. And so we come together and be moderates. That's not necessarily true. And I think your thesis about the fact that like this middle is content free sort of plays into that. The idea that we, since the middle is undefinable, it's really not, it sounds good, but it's not actually a thing we ought to believe. And then the other thing I really liked is the idea that you're like, okay, and right wing and left wing are just pejoratives, which I also think is true.
Right. I mean, for example, nobody ever calls themselves. Nobody will ever come on your show and say, you know what? Well, I'm a far right fanatic, right? They won't do that, but they will come on your show and say, I just ran into a far left loon the other day. So we take the term, and either team will do this, and they'll use it as a way to insult and label the other. But then, by the way, typically what people will do on a team to describe themselves is say, well, I'm actually quite moderate. I vote for the man, not the party. I look at things issue by issue. They'll say all those good things to make themselves appear to be quite rational, but the other guy's a far left loon or a far right lunatic, right?
Right. And I mean, that's particularly true in the media, right? Like, I mean, the media does that constantly, where there's this sort of pejorative of people who are conservative or Trump supporters being far right. And then there's also a tendency to want to define the center in a way that's favorable to you, i.e. the center writers are the ones who agree with us on 95% of things, but maybe have some dissent on taxes or something. That's like not a meaningful, not a meaningful conservative, just somebody who's in that case really, really quite centrist. I guess, where I want to try and like push back a little bit, because I don't want to make it too easy, and it's boring if it's too easy.
That's okay.
So I guess, kind of let's start with, you think if there's this question that we should answer collectively, the idea, I'm reading it, just how much individual liberty and am I willing to surrender in order to solve this problem? So I see a sort of, there's a few levels in which I like see this as, I guess, questionable. So first, that framing is inherently kind of libertarian, right? Like the framing of that question is how much individual liberty am I able to surrender to solve this problem prioritizes individual liberty above, almost by nature, above other concerns that might weigh. And so not from the perspective of a libertarian, this would be like, if you had a group of libertarians together, they might well agree like, oh yeah, this is a very sensible way to make decisions and how we should resolve our policy disputes. But if you're trying to bring in liberals and and lefties, they probably don't even value individual liberty at all, and moreover, they would find the question itself to be sort of like beside the point. They're almost indifferent to individual liberty as a goal. So like, do you think that? Do you see this as like just kind of a starting point internally on the right, or do you see it as like maybe you can persuade the left to kind of come along into this way of thinking about things?
No, I'll sort of semi-reject or modify the characterization.
Sure.
Because I do believe there are absolutes. So if we want to live in a purely relativistic or sort of a Salvador Dali landscape of terms in politics, then we're lost anyway, right? I mean, then anything is whatever we want it to be, and
Sure.
We're done. Which is, by the way, as you know, is what I suggest is what most people do in their discussion and belief of ethics and morality.
Sure.
But if I say, how much individual liberty are we willing to sacrifice? That means something very specific. So individual liberty means the absence of constraints, right? So, or I understand, by the way, that somebody could go further and say, well, true liberty is when you're able to fully surrender to the collective or something. And my response to that is stop it. I'm not going to go to the point where we just become too relativistic. Now, your other point, the other half of what you said is spot on accurate, and it actually supports my argument. So take the libertarian and put them in the room, and take the collectivist and put them in the room. And then you say, all right, how much individual liberty, given that that notion is objectively definable, how much individual liberty are you willing to sacrifice? Now, you're right. The libertarian might say virtually none. And the collectivist might say, well, I'll sacrifice all of it because it's for the greater good. And so I'll sacrifice all of it. But here's the part that's missing. Now let's go to my life as a business person. Mm-hmm. I worked with a lot of troubled companies over the years, many troubled companies. Just so people know, I mean, my background before and since, as I've lived this dual life, before Charlie discovered me and in what we call Northbrook's Got Talent, I mean, I've had over 200 engagements with privately owned companies in every stage of development and on the sales financial side, from startups to turnarounds, everything in between. All right. Mm-hmm. So when you work with a turnaround company, you get a company that's in trouble. You get a bunch of people from the management of that team, and they come into a conference room, and you sit down and you say, all right, things are a mess. And if we don't solve this, we're going to go out of business. And the opinions of the senior management team and whoever they might include from their staff can be just as diverse and just as different as they are between collectivists and libertarians in the world of policy and governance. Here's the difference. In the boardroom, everybody knows that if they don't come up with a plan and try something to move forward together, the company will go out of business. In the United States, too many people believe that a country can't actually go out of business. And so instead of having an honest debate between the collectivist and the libertarian and everybody else who's something other than that in the boardroom, they just stick to their position. And that's well and good, and it leads to a lot of great conflict and classic lines exchanged on social media. But it ultimately right now is heading us on the path towards going out of business as a nation. The United States as a piece of real estate is always going to exist, but the highest and best use of that real estate rapidly is becoming something other than what our founding fathers laid out.
No, I think that's persuasive. I mean, like, the sort of basic problem with that comparison. I mean, I'm not talking about the problem in terms of how you're reasoning it, but rather the problem in terms of, like, why it's so hard to do democracy, or why it's so hard to do a republic generally, is that the incentive structure of the individual voter is not the same as the incentive structure of the people on the board of the corporation, as you well know. And so the problem is, obviously, like, the people who are on a corporate board, even if they have differing ideas, they know they run the board, the company goes out of business, they don't solve the problem. So there's this natural force in bringing them together because they have this ultimate common goal. And I mean, while I think you could say that it's sort of in the abstract, the Americans as such have a common goal of increasing the welfare of the country, increasing how, much better off we are. The question becomes, like, well, but the incentive to, how much individual influence does anybody have, right, if you're outside of government? And so therefore, like, what's the thing that's constraining people and making them actually force them to get together and meet in the middle, as Bruce might say. And I don't think there's very much. And I guess, I think you're right. I think the way to think about it is, like, your piece is right in the sense of, there is no meaningful middle. Coming to a negotiation is really hard. It's just maybe, like, slightly, I guess, the additive maybe is a little more pessimism about the ability to extract this sort of compromise. But I think you're plenty pessimistic already. So I don't know that
I'm plenty pessimistic. Let's stay with the business thing just for fun.
Yeah.
You actually and I knew this would happen because, like Charlie said, you're the most intelligent person he knows. You just triggered a different thought. So let's go one step further with it. Mm-hmm. When a company fails, one of two things sort of typically happen. One is an acquisition, typically by a hostile party, and the other is the shutting of the doors. So let's continue the metaphor from the political standpoint of the United States. The United States is not just it's not like, as I like to sometimes inappropriately say, it's not like a hooker in Times Square in 1978 at 2 o'clock in the morning. It's not whatever you want it to be. It's something very specific. It has a constitution that was drafted and created based on the ideas from the Enlightenment, in particular the Scottish Enlightenment, with structure influenced by Montesquieu, Blackstone, driven by the ideas of Hume and Smith, right? And John Locke basically, language directly lifted and dropped into it, okay? That's what it is. So it's a certain thing. So if we don't find a way to keep it from going out of business, it can be hostily acquired. And it can be hostily acquired by people who believe not in the ideas of, say, Aristotle, Locke, and Smith, but people who believe in the ideas of Plato, Rousseau, and Marx. That's the hostile takeover. The other side of it, the going out of business, what does that look like? Well, that looks an awful lot like Portland this past summer, only multiplied across virtually every city in the country and on a continual basis, right? Because that's what going out of business looks like, an endless stream of chaos. So I don't think either one of those alternatives are good. I happen to love the ideas of the Enlightenment. The old question, Ginger or Marianne, I love both. But when it comes to Plato and Aristotle, I'll choose Aristotle. And those are the ideas I think it's worthwhile to try to preserve and keep that country in business.
Okay. I mean, I think, I would like to, I think similarly, I think at core, being a conservative is about wanting to conserve what is good in the society that you live in, and prioritizing that, realizing how easy it is to destroy things and how hard it is to build them up. So I think that's right on. I want to get some of these questions in here because there's some people with some thoughtful comments. Let's see if I can read this quote. Trudy says that I think another way to meet in the middle is to agree on what a solved problem looks like and to evaluate the results of government interventions and course correct as needed to get closer to the end state. Well, so I mean, I guess one would think that our technocratic institutions are trying to do that. And it's sort of, I guess I wonder, it's so many of, there are a lot of places where like our government actually does the technocratically right thing and things actually end up working out the way they should. But and usually those are the ones where like there's not any politically charged nature to us. This would have been pre-COVID CDC, national health, public health type things. But it's like, for anything that, is politically charged at all, it's like there's not there. The fundamental problem is that we can't agree on what a solved problem looks like. And so I think I'll keep that up because I should keep that up. But the idea that, if there's not going to be, in most cases, there's not going to be mutual agreement on what a solved problem looks like. Maybe in a pandemic, there will be, i.e. the disease is gone. In a war, there will be, i.e. our adversaries are defeated. But in terms of like a lot of the basic domestic political issues that tear us apart, like what is the correct number of immigrants to be allowing into the country every year? Right. I think there's not an agree upon, that's not even an agreeable issue.
Right. You're the person who asked the question puts it very well. And again, it's sort of in business terms. There's the old, from the motivational text, I think it was Stephen Covey, what does success look like? Or start with the end in mind, right? Mm-hmm. It's very interesting. If your viewers think about this, I have a challenge for them. It'd be kind of fun. By the way, write in and have an answer if you've got one. Mm-hmm. When's the last time we passed any piece of legislation or wrote a regulation out of Washington? And this goes to your point, Will, where actually we said what the objective was specifically. We to the extent we have objectives, we say, well, we need to provide more help to the middle class, whatever the hell that means, right? Nobody ever defines it. It sounds good. But nobody says we're going to, and I'm not suggesting anything as I use an example, but we're going to raise the minimum income level, which is at $40,000. We're going to have 90% of the American people above that number in 5 years, right? We don't do that. I'm not suggesting, again, that that's what we do. But we don't set those sorts of specific targets, which again, of course, in the world of business, we do all the time. And the problem is that from a political perspective, and I am Freud called himself a pessimist. I love Freud and I love Hobbes because I think they had human nature right. I don't think I'm a pessimist, though. I think I'm a realist. Mm-hmm. And I do believe that for the typical politician, it's much better to run on a promise than it is to run on an accomplishment. And so if you just speak in lofty terms about somewhere you're going, you don't ever actually have to get there. And that means next election, you can run on still getting there. And that's sort of what we see. And it's by design. And of course, it's despicable. There's no other word for it. It's just despicable.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, that's welcome to civil service government. Adam Townsend has a question. He said, is there a country you feel is resistant to the left and to preserving Western philosophy? I thank you, Adam, for joining us, by the way. I mean, I think it's, obviously it's places like Poland and Hungary and the old Eastern Bloc, right? Poland and Hungary seem to actually, take seriously the idea of conserving their countries and to, preserving their inheritance, their cultural inheritance. And I think that's why they're somewhat role models. I think we talked earlier about how Poland is putting forward social media regulation to protect the right of their citizens to speak freely on social media, even if they would run afoul of Facebook or Twitter's terms of service. If the speech is lawful in Poland, Poland will insist that it be kept up. And I think that's the right answer there. I don't know if you have a different view on this one, Brent.
Well, it's fun when you said role model. One of the pieces I've written recently focus on my idea that we need to start to become like 21st century American dissidents, and that our role models aren't, George Washington and Thomas Paine and John Adams anymore. There are people like Solzhenitsyn, and here you mentioned Poland. There's the book I'm reading at the moment, and nice. I would encourage everybody. So I don't know if it showed.
What was the title of that book? Like Willet says, what was the title?
The Struggle and the Triumph, an autobiography.
The Struggle and the Triumph.
Struggle and the Triumph.
That sounds very interesting.
Yeah.
On Amazon.
So, Walesa is he's an absolute hero, and what I think is interesting, where I live in the North Shore suburbs of Chicago, there is a very heavy Eastern European immigrant population. And there's two things about that population that I find fascinating. One of them goes exactly to the point you're making about tyranny and sort of wanting, being from countries that now they've left, but back in those countries where they had lost their freedom for so long, they're trying to fight so hard to keep it. And so the Eastern European immigrant, you'll say, tell me what it was like behind the Iron Curtain. And they have the horror stories. And to the one, they say, I can't believe what you're doing here in the United States. You're voluntarily taking yourselves down the path that my family suffered under, that we tried to escape from, right?
Right.
Here's the other question that's sort of disturbing to me. If you ask those same people, you say, tell me, back when you were there with your family, your friends, did you have fun? Did you enjoy life? And the answer is, universally in different ways, they all say, yes. Yeah, we enjoyed our family and we had friendship and we socialized and we did other things. And why is that answer disturbing to me? It's disturbing to me because it tells me that we can become accustomed to anything. By nature, we're adaptable. And so as we look at our eroding individual liberty in this country, as we look at the decay of what the founding fathers built for us, 240 years later, my thought is, if you give an insane man in a cement room a really sturdy spoon and enough time, he'll dig his way through the walls. And we've been digging our way through the walls of what was built for us to try to contain us. And my fear is that we will learn to be happy still, and we'll learn to adapt and be happy with less individual freedom, because it's our nature to adapt. And I think we have to be very mindful of that we can sort of get seduced into, okay, well, I'll accept this. It's the way things are now, but I'll still find ways to enjoy myself. Enjoy yourselves, but don't give up the fight either.
I think that's compelling, right? And that connects to COVID as well. Anyway, I kind of want to switch gears a little bit to your second piece, right? So if you're the first piece that Brent had was this one. It's on human events. I'm happy to meet you in the middle, Bruce. Any idea where it is? His second piece, which I also found interesting, much longer piece, too long for us at HE, or at least our opinion side. We don't, but understanding and embracing the role of the 21st century American dissident. And I think, I'm going to try and summarize this one because it's a long enough piece so that we can get to the core of it. I think that the core of this piece is the idea that, like, embracing the idea that as conservatives in 2021, we are in fact dissidents, that what we advocate is outside of the mainstream. And that also indicates the way we need to behave ourselves. And I think part of that is not doing anything crazy and getting yourself banned for no reason, or getting yourself, imprisoned for no good reason. And that, like, there's, that the way that we operate is via persuasion. And I think that's a very useful corrective right now, because, after January 6th and after the overwhelming waves of banning, I'm a big believer that it's not worth losing your account. Like, there are very few things are worth losing your account over to say on social media. And that, even if they are true, even if, it's generally like, that now the important thing is don't lie, right? It's never right to lie. But it's certainly, like, not worth losing your account. Most things are not worth losing your account over because your social media accounts are so valuable. The only thing I really am willing to go to the mat for in the current environment is to make sure that I'm advocating for the change of government policy to make it so that access to social media is a civil right, which is the sort of keystone to being able to say everything else. But I kind of I guess my question to you would be, then, do you feel like I kind of accurately got the gist of the piece, although I summed it up very briefly?
Right.
And what else you kind of add on the sort of subject of being a dissident?
Sure. I mean, and I really would encourage people, if they're interested, this is on my own site, which is BrentHamachek.com. You can go and read it. Yeah, it's 7,000 words, so it's a good solid black cup of coffee read. But here's my contention. People will look at the election of this past year and they'll say, well, and there's all the debate about the number of votes. Let's just say, for fun, that this exact same number, if we had this great vote count that everybody was satisfied with on both sides, let's say it turned out that the exact same number of people voted for Biden and Trump. Let's say that. My argument is it's not relevant, because even though there may be just as many of us in numbers as there are in numbers for the other side, right? The fact is we don't carry the same political atomic weight. We have lost the entire infrastructure of the federal government. We've lost, of course, House, Senate, and executive branch. We've lost all of the large municipal governments around the country, virtually all of those, mayorships and city councils and so on. We've lost the entertainment industry. We've lost the education industry, K through college. We've lost the mainstream media, and we have lost the large corporate boardrooms. So whether or not if you want to count up human bodies and do sort of a pure mathematical, almost a Bentham-like utilitarian count of numbers, maybe we're the same, but we're not the same, because their weight is much greater than ours. And that means that we do not have the same rights that they do. And you make the argument, well, the Constitution says we do. Okay, great. Who's enforcing the Constitution? Well, it's not us. And if you say, well, we have natural rights, they're given to us by God. Okay, sure, great. Don't the citizens in China have the same natural rights, or the citizens in Iran? But their government doesn't allow their expression, do they? So the fact of the matter is that we are now sitting in a situation where we've lost all of the important power structures in the country, and we do not have the same rights that they have. And that means that we are now dissidents, and it means we're cast in a very long game. With regard to what you were saying, well, it's like a one point among many, and it's a great point. And I'll make a bigger point out of it. You say, don't just give up your social media account by saying something that'll get you banned. This dissident movement that now is underway for us is going to produce a tremendous number of martyrs. We don't need to produce them as if they're a manufacturing line in Detroit. So we don't need to produce them on purpose. They're going to get produced anyway. And what we need are people in the fight who are able to continue to press forward within the system as they're able to use it, right? And by the way, holding my nifty book back up that I'm pushing today, the Lech Walesa book, is exactly the point that he made, that we do not need to produce enough more slaughtered Polish martyrs. We've had plenty of those. We need people who can fight. And how do we do that? What's the best way to do that? Sort of tie that together. And there's a lot of different specific ideas within the piece that I wrote. But I'll make this argument. In all of Western civilization history, the most important example of a dissident on the secular side and on the religious side, to me, it's inarguable. On the secular side, it's Socrates, and on the religious side, it's Christ. Both of these people have two things in common. Number one, they both paid with their lives for their dissidency. Number two, however, the more important piece is that the way they became important dissidents is by asking questions. And they ask questions relentlessly. And the questions they asked changed the world. And everything that's happened in Western religion since, and everything that's happened in Western secular world since, has happened because of the questions they asked. And we need to start to ask these questions. We need to let the people observe what's happening to us. We need them to start to question it, because the only way, we can reverse this is to have enough people who are part of sort of this group that's not involved actively in our repression, but they're involved in it passively. We need those people to see what's happening to us, and we need them to say, gosh, that's not right. And we need a lot of them to say it, and it's going to take a lot of time. And there's ways we can get them to say it. So embrace your inner Socrates or embrace your inner Christ, depending upon which you might prefer, and embrace the ideas of Walesa and Solzhenitsyn and Sakharov and those other great Eastern European dissidents.
Yeah, no, I think that's wise, right? Like, it's not the first time that, and relative to like the way that the Soviets had it, we have it much better. I mean, it's not to say that there aren't like martyrs in our movement in the sense of people who've lost their social media accounts, and that there aren't serious consequences for that happening. Again, the reason I think this should be a civil right, but we have it easier than other dissident movements in the past. Even the recent past. So I think that the general attitude is right, like that we need to be trying to persuade people, trying to ask questions, I think is a good way of pointing that out. And a general, I think that's a good thesis. Let's take a look at some of these comments. So Xfin Gaming says that we should be getting involved at the local level, becoming precinct captains, joining our local GOP committee, engaging with like-minded neighbors, and run for office. I think that's right. I'm probably going to try and get involved in local GOP politics. Well, actually, I'm moving. That's the thing. I have to move to Virginia shortly. So, but like in general, I think this is good advice. If you're in an area and you're there, you should get involved.
Could I address that? I think it's not only is it a good point, you might be able to argue it's the point. And it's also a hard point anymore for people to really enthusiastically embrace. And here's my theory as to why. And it has a lot to do with the internet and really in the 24-hour cable news world. A long time ago, back in the old days, when not just television, but people were in black and white, like me. You might think people were always in color. We weren't. We were just shades of gray. Back in the old days, you had news that came on at 5:30 or 6:30, depending upon where you lived. And that was your national news. And then you went about your life. And life itself was very local. With the advent now of the exposure to the national scene 24/7, everybody is constantly looking at the big picture. And as they look at the big picture, it makes the small picture seem sort of tedious and nettlesome and boring and just a waste of my time. Why would I get involved with the County Drain Commission when there's all this chaos in Washington, right? But at the end of the day, if we don't get involved at the ground up, I mean, certainly George Soros knows the value of being involved in the ground up, local politics. He's found that trick. If we don't get involved in the ground up, we can't build the foundation that we need to take on the bigger piece. And so it's so important to get involved, to really, and what's the key? It's to have the patience to get involved, to realize, well, I know Donald Trump just got to be president right away. Gosh, I'd like to do that. And if I can't be president, well, why bother? there's lots of reasons to bother. So do get involved. I think that the viewer writing in is asked just a great question and made a great point.
I agree. I definitely think, and Excellent Gaming says that you're in Northern Virginia, and I'm happy to, try and ping me on Twitter. My DMs are open. If you can ping me on Twitter, I'd be happy to get you involved. I don't know why I keep my DMs open now, but it actually just makes things easier. Before that, people had really hard time reaching me for like TV hits and things like that. So even just once a day checking my the DM inbox is a way to avoid that problem. Trudy has another comment: the idea that they think we're evil, not just wrong. That's sort of an independent problem with, I think, the left's way of looking at the world. I don't know who said it. The left thinks that conservatives are evil. Conservatives just think that progressives are dumb. Right? Like we're not. There's this sort of like lingering weird behavior. And I mean, nothing exemplifies that more than the reaction to the passing of Rush Limbaugh, where, I had, this total, you had a blue check in my mentions just being absolutely appalling. I don't know if I used to have it pinned. Oh, here it is. So, he basically immediately started with this, like, hope he can handle the heat. Like that's who they are. That's what they do. They're glad glad you're dead. Like the conservatives don't do that. They didn't do that for Ruth Bader Ginsburg. They don't do that for anybody else. It's not, it's not a good thing when people die.
Right. What? Right. And of course we're sort of intentionally or otherwise, we're almost moving into the piece that I also did on my own site about entitled "Why They Cheat," which was something I wrote in answer to the election in 2020, but really answering this bigger question and trying to take a look at ethics and why it is that we seem to be better behaved on team right than they are on team left. So if we could, I'd love to pull that apart for a minute, because I think it's a really worthwhile conversation. I don't believe that for a minute that we are any better as human beings, as individual people, than they are. My experience in the world of business, which has just been, by the way, I'm like of all the guests you have on, you don't have any on who are as blessed as I am. I have lived an extraordinary life. The things I've had a chance to do, the things I've had a chance to work on, the people I've met, and the experience I've been able to get. I'm like part Walter Mitty and part Forrest Gump. So my life's been extraordinary. But I can tell you that I have watched, just to sort of summarize it, I've watched Trump voters steal $500,000 from their business partners straight up, right? Mm-hmm. So we're just as dreadful as they are. And one of the things that's funny, so now we'll with your intellect, we'll do a little logic class and have some fun. If you ask the typical person, if you say, "Hey, I had a question for you. Are you ethical?" And the person will say, "Yeah, of course I am." Okay, great. So do you think that there are people in the world who aren't ethical? They'll say, "Oh, absolutely." All right. So if we're going to ask that, let's just stay here domestically. If I'm going to ask 330 million people, many of them here legally, if I'm going to ask them, "Hey, are you ethical?" and they're going to say yes, and then I'm going to say, "Are other people not ethical?" and they're going to say yes, well, then we have a problem, don't we? Right? Mm-hmm. Because these two things can't be true. So the second question, the question that never gets asked of people, is when they say, "Yeah, I'm ethical." What we never ask is, "Oh, great. Under what system?" And if you do ask somebody that, more than 99 out of 100 will kind of look at you and go, what do you mean system? They don't have any idea what you mean. And that's because very few people actually not only study ethics, but pick an ethical system, if you will, and say, "I'm going to try to follow this." Right?
Yeah, no, I mean, other than sort of a vague golden rule, I don't even really think about the ethical system or precepts I adhere to. I guess the way I look at ethics, honestly, like I'm very, ethics in college and the sort of philosophical, to the extent I took anything related to ethics in college, it reminded me of like trolley problem type questions, right? Like you find these sort of ethical problems on the mark that are very difficult, that do not have an obvious intuitive answer, right? It's not murder is bad. Well, yeah, everybody agrees with that one. It's like, well, under what circumstances, is it okay to pull the trolley and knowingly cause the death of one person to save five? Like a bunch of kind of abstract, like very difficult questions on the margins. And for me in ethics, actually like the Stoics better on this, because they look at the problem totally differently. They don't say, is the primary problem of ethics that we need to solve these sort of edge cases, right, and have a completely cohesive ethical system. But rather, the problem is that we're not virtuous, and virtue is like a muscle. It's something you get by working out, right? Like, are you, quick to anger? Are you patient? Are you so the extent to which, rather than seeing so when you ask somebody the question, are you ethical? It's like, well, I mean, obviously they don't think they do bad things. It's like, but I guess really the better question for any individual to ask themselves is like, do I behave virtuously consistently, or am I intemperate or mean or angry or jealous or envious? You go down the list. Anyway, I just want to but I'll let you take that from there.
Well, yeah, let's stay with that and build off it. So when the person says that they feel that they're ethical, but they can't tell you under what system. And by the way, there are real systems. You mentioned the golden rule, which is, of course, traces itself to scripture, but the golden rule is also sort of a variation of Kant's categorical imperative, which is a whole method for making ethical decisions. And people can read my piece and then they can read further, and there's hyperlinks and things, right, if they want to look more at this. But at the end of the day, here's what somebody really means when they say they're ethical. They are saying they're ethical based on what they decide is ethical. In other words, they're moral relativists. Virtually everybody's a moral relativist. And that means we are, and that means the team left people are. We're no better than they are. So why do we seem to behave better? And now I feel like you set me up, only you didn't. So let's talk about the Stoics for a moment. Because my argument is the reason that we tend to behave better is that, we live under a bell curve. So everything I say is sort of, based on that notion, right? And there's outlying data points, and there's 10 standard deviations from the mean. But under the bell curve, 1 or 2 standard deviations away, that's where we mostly live. And most of us are folks that have a sense of duty to something objective outside of ourselves. And that is either the Constitution or scripture.
Interesting.
Oh. We tend to be other. And those two objective things are like a little better angel on our shoulder. So when we want to do something wrong, especially in the public square, when we're tempted to let that moral relativism that just is about maximizing pleasure and minimizing pain, when we want to cheat, if you will, we have that sense of duty that taps us on the shoulder. And what you find more often, again, under the bell curve with team left members, when you say, do you have a sense of duty? They'll say, of course I do. Say, who's it to? Humanity, to those who are suffering, to those who need help. But what does that really mean? It means whatever they want it to mean. It's just another layer of relativism. There's no objective standard to it.
I don't think I agree with you on this one.
That's okay.
I think, I'll push back a little bit. So the way I look at it, I might disagree with the entire thesis here. I don't know. I disagree with a lot.
Okay, good.
So basically my view on this is actually, I think the left is not moral relativist at all. I think that they're they have a very objective moral construct. It's not one we're familiar with. It's not one rooted in tradition or history. It's one kind of confabulated and invented by critical theorists over the last 50 to 60 years. But there's objective moral content to it, right? The level of confidence that they have in their moral pronouncements about race and sex and gender, and like how moral you are if you believe those things and how immoral you are if you do not. How there's not even a path to redemption if you do something that is racist. Like I don't see that as moral relativism. I see that as moral absolutism to an extreme that the right doesn't adhere to. And oddly enough, I think maybe you could make the reverse argument that it is the overwhelming moral absolutism of the left that leads them to be willing to violate other moral precepts on the grounds that they are so correct about this one other thing that the means justify the end. And further, that the relative humility, I would say that, I think to the extent, maybe it's not, I wouldn't say it's moral relativism, but there's within, I think, the right, there's more of a diversity of ethical commitments, right? Like, it's not, if the left is completely totalized by anti-racism, the right might think, we have these commitments to scripture and to our religion and to our country and to our family, and they're connected, and obviously all flow from scripture. I don't want to speak on other people's moral philosophies, but at least there's this they come from tradition, they're passed on to us, and it strikes me that it leads to a sort of a greater humility, the sense that we might be, I feel like people on the right are more willing to admit that they might well be wrong about these things, and the modern left, maybe the left 30 years ago was more relativist, but the modern left of 2020 is not relativist at all. They're just overwhelmingly absolutist, and their framework is completely, subsumed by anti-racism.
So let me take that and respectfully disagree back.
Okay.
So, because in a sense, I sort of think that you're making my argument, and let me say that I would agree with your argument if you could find me, I don't know, if you could just do a broad mass general sampling, not on the campus, say, of Georgetown, but a broad sampling of what we would call American Team Left members, and get, I don't know, 3 out of 1,000 to define critical race theory for you. They can't. They don't have any idea what it is. The typical person is acting absent any knowledge of any system, and that
I agree with that. I agree with that. Right.
So when I list the categorical imperative or objectivist ethics, or Bentham's utilitarianism, or Mill's utilitarianism, Mill the Younger, when I list these different systems, the Christian ethic, most people haven't studied them. They don't know what they are. Just like the notions within critical race theory. At the end of the day, we're all simply walking around avoiding pleasure and pain. But let me address your point about this notion of race and other things. What do you get? Because one of the ethical systems that's out there is that of altruism, the one that's always attributed to Christianity, which is interesting to me because it was invented 1,800 years later by an atheist. So I'm not quite sure how Christians are supposed to be altruists when the term and the idea was invented by an atheist almost 2,000 years after Christ. Anyway, the notion of altruism is this idea of self-sacrifice, right? So self-sacrifice, and the only way you can fulfill your ethical duty is by self-sacrificing. And the perfect ethic is where you self-sacrifice with no benefit to yourself at all, strictly to others. If you strip it to its core, that's what's behind the entire notion of the whole white guilt thing and all of it, right? That's what's there. Now, what happens when you throw altruism as an obligation? You throw it into the arms of a moral relativist who's trying to maximize pleasure and minimize pain. What do you get? I'll tell you what you get. A ton of conflict and aberrant behavior because they don't reconcile. And that's why their behavior doesn't reconcile. And because they don't have that better angel on their shoulder, that objective standard that calls them to duty in a good Stoic sense, that says, thou shalt and thou shalt not, they're a mess. Now, you did use the term the end justifies the means, which, of course, is from the Prince. And I argue in my piece that's exactly how they operate. Because if you operate as a pure moral relativist, and if you operate without any limitation from duty tapping on your shoulder, that's where you land. You land where the end justifies the means. And that's why you cheat, because it's very, very easy for you to justify that. And by the way, still say, I'm ethical. He's not, but I am.
Right. So, I mean, maybe we're just I think we're probably, what we're having is a definitional issue where we're defining we think of moral relativism slightly differently, right? I would say that, the person who has an absolute belief in the rightness of their like moral judgments would be a moral, and like essentially not a moral relativist, right? To me, a moral relativist is a person who like is queries whether we can know the good, that sort of thing. And so it kind of and so like there are, I mean, I guess so that I guess that's where I'm coming down. And so like, because the way it feels like you're defining moral relativism, it's like you could have someone who has this absolute belief in the rightness of pursuing anti-racism and the dominance of like basically it has the liberation of the oppressed as their primary ethical principle, believes in it full-heartedly, thinks that it's the basis for determining good and wrong actions, but yet because they do crude Machiavellian stuff, they're still ultimately moral relativists.
Well, like here, look, when I talk about somebody as a moral relativist, I'm going back to the father of the concept, and that's Thomas Hobbes. So he's the one that really introduced this notion. And I think that of all the great minds in the history of political thought, he was the greatest. Not because I love his solutions for us as people, which says that we're destined to only be able to live functionally under a strong monarch, but because I think he had our nature absolutely spot on right. And it was he who said that our notions of what's right and wrong are driven by these concepts of pleasure and pain, those things that attract us and those things that we have an aversion to. And I think that's the way most people live their lives. And so, and they do that, they do that regardless of their politics. Your politics has nothing to do with that particular notion, but it is. So there's a couple ways to counteract that. First of all, try to develop or try to, identify an ethical system that can provide you standards of conduct to help you live your life. Now, I'm born of a mixed philosophical marriage. I'm half Catholic and half objectivist.
I see a little bit of both of those in your, I can see it. That makes sense.
Talk about the orange and the green problem in Ireland. They've got nothing on me. But operationally, my day-to-day life and my business life, when you and I work together at Human Events, I very functionally live by objectivist sort of rules of behavior. It's a whole different sort of argument about objectivism and Christianity and how you could really, the two look very much alike and function except at the most extreme ends. But the point is, I have a system I try to use. I'm imperfect. I make all sorts of mistakes, but at least I'm trying to follow something that provides some rules of the road for me, other than just my simple primal appetites. And then, of course, the other thing to do is to try to have instilled in yourself that sense of duty that can help you turn to Scripture, turn to the Constitution. Being an American is not a Rorschach test. You either believe in the Constitution and the amendments, or you don't. So you're either a good American or you're not. You can be a good person, but you can't be a good American if you don't embrace the objective notions of the Constitution. So either find a system of ethics that you can use as a guideline, or find yourself a higher calling to objective duty, or better yet, both. And then you'll find it easier to make good choices, I think. Could be wrong, but it's one way to look at it. I certainly would love to read the piece. And then anybody who writes me notes, just so your viewers know, anyone who writes me a note, I always respond. If you don't like something, I don't care. I love to respond to that.
Yeah, that's true. Brent is a very, very responsive person. That's one of his strongest attributes and my weakest. Honestly, I tend to,
Well, that's why we're working together, right?
Exactly. Well, we've been going an hour, so I gotta get going here. So we should wrap it up. But I want to thank you, Brent, for coming on to discuss your pieces and for your continued work for us at Human Events.
Thanks for having me. I've been wanting to sit down and have this kind of a conversation with you, because the sort of the joking aside, and for everyone who only knows Will from his show, I can tell you from real life working with him, he's every bit the person in real life that he appears to be on YouTube or Periscope or any other platform. Extremely intelligent, highest integrity, rational, fair, all those things. And so sitting down to do this with you is something I've been wanting to do from the day we first connected. And I think for me, it's a privilege for you to give me your platform to share.
Oh, not at all. Not at all. Happy to do it. Okay, I've been slow on doing Periscopes lately, so it's a good reason to get back in the groove. But anyway, yeah, no, I appreciate working with Brent incredibly. I mean, as you guys see, very generous, thoughtful, hardworking guy. Really appreciate all you guys watching and all your comments. If you're still hanging around, which about like 120 of you have been sticking out through the whole hour, which I am very impressed by, hit that subscribe button on youtube.com/humanevents, because Periscope's going to disappear on us in about a month. So please do that, or at facebook.com/humaneventsmedia. That will get you access to our things, and if you aren't following already. So with that, I think I'm going to leave it there. Keep following us at humanevents.com, and I'll see you soon. Peace.
All right. You look good in flannel, Will.
You do too. Later.
Bye.